Saturday nights at home in my apartment weeping over my regrets, so this is a nice change of pace. So the book is The Underground Railroad. I first came up with the idea for the book 16 years ago. I was sitting on the couch and came across a reference to the railroad and remembered how in fourth grade, when I first heard about it, my teacher told me I envisioned a literal railroad. And then she, of course, explained how it actually worked, and I was very disappointed. But it seemed like that would be a kind of a weird idea for a book. And I quickly added the complicating scenario of each state our protagonist is going through is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels. That was the first association I had. Each state is a new island presenting a different take on American history. It's Gulliver's Travels, but it's also any heroic journey. The structure is very old. The Odyssey, Pilgrim's Progress. Anytime a hero is tested by a series of allegorical trials on the way to enlightenment. It sounded pretty good, but I knew if I did it back then, I would have screwed it up. I was sort of a Gen X layabout, and I figured if I wrote some more books, I might become a better writer, and if I became a more mature person, I might be able to bring that wisdom to treat the subject with the honor it deserved. So each time I finished a book, I would go back to my notes and think, am I ready? And each time the answer was no, and so I didn't. And then finally, about 3 years ago, I had sold the book to my editor, but I was feeling a bit unsure of whether to follow through. So I decided to tell my wife about the idea about the Underground Railroad. Sometimes in a marriage, you have to make conversation to kill the silences. And so I told her about the idea, and she said, well, I don't want to say that the book you're working on now about a Brooklyn writer going through a midlife crisis is dumb per se. But this Underground Railroad book sounds pretty good. So I was like, huh. And then I decided to tell my agent about it, and I've worked with her for many years, and she's always very supportive, and she just said, well, I think both ideas sound good, which wasn't very helpful. But then she did something she never does, which is email me on a Sunday, and usually if your agent talks to you on a Sunday, you've screwed something up. But she just said, I can't stop thinking about the Underground Railroad. So that was 2. Wednesday was shrink day, so I told my shrink, and she said, what are you, crazy? I mean, we both know you're crazy, but this book actually sounds like it's the one you should be doing now. So that was 3. So let's look my editor, and I told him the idea, and he just said, giddy up, mofo, or words to that effect. And that's old-time publishing talk for, that's a good idea, and we should pursue it. So I was off. So dealing with slavery, you have to deal with a lot of grisly research. There are very few histories of the Underground Railroad, not as many as you'd think. But my main source of research were slave narratives, the big ones, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and in the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project sent out people to interview former slaves, people who'd been kids and teenagers at the time of slavery, to get their oral histories. And I just went through them. Some are only 2 paragraphs long, some are 10 pages, and I went through hoovering up nouns and verbs and adjectives, hopefully to make it sound realistic. And in going through all these different histories, I realized it was my first adult reckoning with slavery. When I was 8, my parents made us all crowd around the TV to watch Roots, and that was my childhood acquaintance. In college, I studied history, and that's a different sort of older acquaintance. But as a grown-up with children, I had sort of had this, this real reckoning. I was acquainted with the after effects of slavery and its reverberations throughout the decades, through Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, the destruction of the black family, institutional racism in all its forms, from the incarceration state to the systematic neglect of urban schools. I've been stopped by cops, frisked, handcuffed, in the modern-day equivalent of a free person being stopped by a slave patroller and being forced to show your identity papers. You can see the after effects of slavery in nearly every sector of American life. For example, sometimes even in a gathering of the academic community. It's hard to face our history, no matter where you're coming from. If you're a white person, say descended from slave owners, how do you come to grips with the fact that your great-great-great-great-grandfather or grandmother beat, brutalized, tortured people for profit? How do you sit with those facts? If you're African American, say a third-generation college, growing up with the first black president, how do you contemplate the magnitude of the degradations suffered by your ancestors? What were their names? Where did they live and die? Alabama, Florida? How did they live? What did they suffer? Like many black Americans, my family history sort of thins out 100 years ago, and the key to who I am is lost in the void of slavery, which swallows everything. So how do we as folks living in 2017 reckon with our shared history? One choice I made early on with the Underground Railroad allowed me to make the book more than just a story of an escaped slave in 1850 and enlarge it. It's not a straightforward historical novel, the tip-off being that there's a literal Underground Railroad. That's a clue. It's not like I belong to some historical novelist union, and at the next meeting, Hilary Mantel, author of Wolf Hall, is going to say, do I have to choke somebody? There are no sort of rules about what you can do, and being a fiction writer, the fun thing is making things up. So in moving different historical episodes around, I can enlarge the story, bring in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the reign of the KKK, and it becomes a much bigger novel and a much bigger course I've assembled in the pages. I mentioned the Gulliver's Travels structure. Each state our protagonist travels through is a different state of American possibility, what might have been. So in this book, North Carolina is not our North Carolina, but it's a white supremacist state where any black person can be lynched if they're found out in the street, in the sort of logical conclusion of Jim Crow laws. Cora, our protagonist, hides in an attic until she can find passage out of North Carolina. It's an echo of Harriet Jacobs hiding in an attic in her slave narrative. And you think hiding in an attic, Anne Frank, and then suddenly I can enlarge the conversation in the book to include the oppression of Jews in 1930s Germany and compare it to the oppression of black people in America in 1850. It turns out that white supremacists the world over use the same language. They're all reading the same horrible texts and getting their ideas from the same place. And then suddenly, the story of one girl's escape from bondage is an exploration of the demonization of the other in all its forms, whether it's blacks and Jews being hunted up or Mexicans and Muslims being rounded up today. If you talk about our racial past, you're always talking about our racial present, going through slave narratives, reading how free men and free women describe being stopped for their ID papers. I saw that they use the same language that I used in describing when I've been stopped. And it's uncanny, the continuity, the continuum of humiliation, and I think it's worth talking about. So now the book's been out for a few months, and I've been starting to go visit different kinds of classrooms where the book is being taught. And it's always interesting seeing the different kinds of conversations you have in these classroom visits. I've learned a few things over the years. High school students always want to know, what does it mean? College kids want to know, is my interpretation right? And grad students want to know, how can I get an agent? On the is my interpretation right topic, college kids can sometimes have a hard time with ambiguity, and there's a lot of ambiguity in this book and a lot of other books I've written. They're learning to trust their own interpretation of things, their interpretations of the world, of themselves, and their notions are getting larger and larger each semester. And sometimes they need, I think, a little push to be comfortable with their own conclusions, that approval from another voice. With a book like mine, when I talk to students, I hope that I can get across that I actually can't tell them what this means or what that means. It's no longer my book anymore. Now it's out in the world. It's theirs now, and they have to find their own way, bit by bit, as we all do. So thanks a lot.